It is of no use to object to this freedom which places any and every kind of content in the universal passive medium of duty and knowing by maintaining that another content ought to have been placed in it. For whatever content it be, it contains the blemish of determinateness, from which pure knowing is free. Determinateness, which pure knowing can disdainfully reject, or equally can accept. Every content, because it is determinate, stands on the same level as any other, even if it does seem to be characterized by the elimination in it of the element of particularity. It may seem that since in the actual case duty in general is sundered into an antithesis and thereby into the antithesis of individuality and universality, the duty whose content is the universal itself directly contains the nature of pure duty, and form and content are thus completely in accord. It might seem then that action for the general good is to be preferred to action for the good of the individual, but this universal duty is simply what already exists as an absolute substance, as law and right, and is valid on its own account independently of the individual's knowledge and conviction, not to mention his own immediate interest. It is therefore precisely against the form of that duty that morality in general is directed. But, as regards its content, that too is a determinate content, insofar as the general good is opposed to the good of the individual. Consequently, its law is one from which conscience knows itself to be absolutely free, and it gives itself the authority to add to and take from, to neglect as well as fulfill it. Then again, the above distinction between duty to the individual and duty to the universal is, in accordance with the nature of the antithesis as such, not something definitely fixed. The truth is rather that what the individual does for himself also contributes to the general good. The more he has made provision for himself, not only is there a greater possibility of his being of service to others, but his actual existence itself consists only in his being and living in contact with others. His individual enjoyment essentially has the meaning of putting what is his own at the disposal of others and of helping them to obtain their enjoyment. Therefore, in the fulfillment of duty to individuals and so to oneself, the duty to the individual is also fulfilled. Any weighing and comparing of duties which might be made here would be tantamount to calculating the advantage accruing to the universal from an action. But firstly, the result would be that morality would be made dependent on the necessary contingency of insight. And secondly, it is precisely the essence of conscience to have no truck with this calculating and weighing of duties and to make its own decision without reference to any such reasons. Paragraph 645 is a rather longish one, and it's also a very important one to look at closely as we're proceeding through this morality section. You notice that there's reference to what has just been discussed in the previous paragraphs, particularly in the one just preceding it, 644, what we're going to talk about in just a moment as the blemish of determinateness. We'll come back to that very, very soon and expand on that. But it's also an important turning point because there's a sort of realization on the part of the determinate spirit that is morality. And I say that in somewhat of a facetious way because when we think about the morality that's being discussed here in this section, as you know, so many people have commented and as you may have suspected as you're reading through it, what we're talking about here is not merely Kantian morality, but a what we can call Kantian-esque morality, a sort of, on the one hand, sort of a reductive attitude towards Kant and the kind of moral orientation that he not only articulates but also represents. So on the one hand, sort of a simplification of it, which is what you need to do in order to actually make it useful and applicable. On the other hand, sort of a hyper-Kantianization of it as Hegel thinks through some of the implications of what it was that Kant was bringing to the table. And let's come back to the first one, and this is all before we get into the text itself. So what can we say about Kantian morality? It stresses universality, Allgemeinheit, right? And we notice that plays a major role within this paragraph. Anything that is going to be genuinely moral has to be stripped of its determinate content and abstracted as much as possible into some very general ideas. And you notice, if you know your Kant, that the categorical imperative itself has to take on several different formulations, which are all supposed to be essentially, on the same page with each other, but we can explore and see that there could be some problems with that. But the idea is that on the one hand, this is what's running through any genuinely moral being, whether they've read philosophy or not. And on the other hand, it's articulated in its deepest, in its most rigorous fashion in the works of the person who followed out this stuff, working with a, you might say, purified faculty of reason, purifying itself in the process. That's a rather dynamic aspect to Kant's work. And these are all supposed to map onto each other. And Hegel comes along and essentially in this morality section points out to us over and over and over again, it's not that simple. You cannot get away from what here he's calling the blemish of determinateness, the Makel, the thing that's wrong with it, the flaw, der Bestimmtheit. Bestimmung is making something not just actual, but particularized, saying, here's what we're doing. And it could be done by providing context, as when we talk about the circumstances of an action or a choice, right? We explored all these things much earlier in all of these qualifications that can be said about the moral action, the Handlung, the comportment. But that's what's really being discussed here, and that winds up being the scandal, the stumbling block of this approach to morality that is not just that of Kant, but of so many other Enlightenment thinkers as well. So let's take up the text now. He says, it is no use to object to this freedom, which places any and every kind of content in the universal passive of duty, Pflicht, right, and knowing, Wissen, by maintaining that another content ought to have been placed in it. For whatever content it be, it contains the blemish of determinateness from which pure knowing, now notice what he says, pure knowing is free, determinateness, which pure knowing can disdainfully reject or equally can accept. So pure knowing is quite powerful here in relation to the determinateness of the particular duty, the duty of the particular person in these contexts, in this situation, right? And so the objection that can be made is quite simply this. Why did you focus on this instead of on this? And here we might take a little bit of a digression and think about some of the things that happen in our own time. That also did happen in Hegel's time. Think about what we've come to call whataboutism, where somebody says, hey, we got a moral problem here. Somebody should have done this, but instead they did this. And then somebody else comes along and says, okay, what about this? And you can imagine them saying it in that kind of stupid, goofy tone of voice, because it is really a stupid, thoughtless way of using your faculty of reason, right? It's done usually for ideological reasons, very often driven by emotional needs, and shows a kind of deceptiveness or lack of self-reflectiveness on the part of the person employing it. And whataboutism is essentially just substituting one content in place of another in order to nullify all of them. It's really a form of what Hegel here would call skepticism in the Phenomenology. You can go back to that section and check that out if you want. But we can also say that one could do this in a more genuine way and say, well, wait a second, you're focusing on this, but this really is important over here. Hey, you're leaving this out. That's not the same thing as whataboutism. It's more earnest or honest, if we want to use categories that have been coming up throughout the reason and the spirit section describing orientations of people. Now, the problem is, once you start going down that course, any content is as good as any other content. It's totally up to pure knowing, the subject in this case, to decide which one they want to focus on. And so, really, it's no good objection to say, well, this is determinate, so we're not going to focus on that. So he goes on and he says, every content, because it is determinate, stands on the same level as any other, even if it does seem to be characterized by the elimination in it of the element of particularity. Now, here is where the turning point comes, right? Because Hegel is showing us his hand at this point. What's the hand? Well, if we want to look ahead, what we're going to see here is, at first, a prioritization of the universal over the individual or the particular, right? The universal is what gets us out of this merely particular, merely determinate way of looking at things. And here again, you might think of Kant, and you might think of what he says in the groundwork about categorical imperatives. Why is it that a categorical imperative is the only possible source of morality? Well, because any hypothetical imperatives, anything that is conditioned, right? The if-then in the hypothetical imperative is a set of conditionings. If you want to be happy, think about the maxims that fall under counsels of prudence, then you ought to do this and this and this. Everybody does want to be happy, but Kant says that can't be the source of morality. If you want to accomplish this thing, now we're getting to what he calls rules of skill, right? Less general, more particular, well, then you ought to do this. So, if you don't want to be in debt, then you ought to save some money each month and don't put everything into banks because, maybe interest isn't that effective. Some of it needs to go into mutual funds, some into real estate, et cetera, et cetera. We have all this sort of financial planning stuff. Kant says that has nothing to do with morality. Morality must be totally universal. So where we're going is a reversal, where the particular assumes an important role, and we're also seeing an unveiling, where the universal isn't quite so universal and pure as we make it out to be. So let's see how he does this. He says, it may seem that since in the actual case, duty in general is sundered into an antithesis. And antithesis here, Gegensatz. We could say contradiction as well if we wanted to. We don't have to insist on this. There isn't a thesis, antithesis, synthesis to look for in this. So don't let the word antithesis trip you up there. So an antithesis of what? An opposition between individuality, Einzelheit, right? And the universal, universality, Allgemeinheit. And he says, this is a split in duty, a contradiction within duty. That should be a little thought-provoking right there. Wait a second. How can there be a contradiction within duty or an opposition within duty? Well, one way is that you have different duties playing off against each other, and one of them is assumed to be more important than the others, and then those others are not real duties at all, right? Or we could go a little bit deeper and say there's something inherent in the notion of duty or obligation or normativity that is being explored here. And that, I think, is the right interpretation. So he goes on and he says, the duty whose content is the universal itself directly contains the nature of pure duty. Its form and content are thus completely in accord. So on the one side over here, we've got the universal duty, looking at duty universally, we might say, or attributing universality to it. And their form and content are harmonious with each other. They're not striving against each other. And then what else do we have? He says, it might seem then that the action for the general good, so general good is the universal, right, is to be preferred to action for the good of the individual. Because if we think about the individual side, what we have are determinate duties. And here, notice that he's not talking about duties simply to others, duties also to oneself. These satisfy in some way one's own interest. And so people are suspicious of that. Wait a second, if you're doing what's good for you, it's not really out of duty, is it? It's really just satisfying your own desires, your own wishes, making your position better in relation to the general good. You're not helping the general good. You might actually be getting in the way of it. You might be taking something away from the general good. So he says that, here we go. It might seem the action for the general good is to be preferred to action for the good of the individual, but this universal duty, here is where we have the unveiling. This universal duty, he says, is simply what already exists as an absolute substance. Now, the way in which Miller is translating this, already existing, vorhanden ist. It's already out there. It's already available, you could say. And what he's translating as absolute substance is als an und für sich seiende Substanz, right? So we've seen this an und für sich formulation many times throughout the phenomenology. There's something that's been attained, and this, this was an accomplishment over the course of the development of human consciousness that's being traced out here. But if we're not at the end, anytime that we have something that is an und für sich, in and for itself, it's always in a certain way not yet there. It's presenting itself as that, but it's not really that. We'll see how in just a moment. And he goes on and he says, as law and right? Recht und Gesetz, nice catchphrase there. Law and right, so the normativity that is supposed to be that of the society. And he says, and is valid on its own account, independently of the individual's knowledge and conviction, not to mention his own immediate interest. Now that is a really important qualification there, right? Traditionally, we understand the universal, the general good, the duty towards that, as something that is, in fact, independent of the individual's knowledge. Maybe an individual could be mixed up in relation to it. Too bad for that individual. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, as we say, right? And we say that, and it goes back all the way to medieval times. Also, it doesn't matter about the person's conviction. They may feel that, the law, the general rule, is wrong in some way, but it's still up to them to follow it. It has priority. It has validity. It's Gult, right? So he goes on and he says, not to mention his own immediate interest, it is therefore precisely against the form of that duty that morality in general is directed. Now, that therefore, does that make sense to you? Shouldn't morality be on the side of the universal? The general good? Law and right? Well, morality here is critical. It doesn't just want to take some sort of guidance and say, okay, got it. The law is the law is the law. This is not the sort of deontology that is simply rule following for its own sake. This is where, human reason, particularly practical reason, is by being critical inherently productive. Something well worth remembering as we go through this. So he goes on and he says, here we go. As regards its content, because this was against the form of that duty, that too is a determinate content, insofar as the general good is opposed to the good of the individual. Now we go beyond unmasking or unveiling, a genealogical sort of approach, you might say, and we note something that is inherent in the actuality of law and right. Law and right have to take place through some sort of institution. And that institution, or whatever you want to call it, the Wirklichkeit, the actuality of it, has to be particularized as well. You know, you have a city, and the city's general good overrides that of the individual citizen. Who decides how that works? It's the mayor or the city council or the alder people or whatever it's going to be. The city planner, the engineer in some cases will make decisions. And, you know, we could go on and on and on with this, all the way down to the level of the social workers and police officers and people who are making decisions on the spot in ostensibly for the universal, for the duty to the general good, but it's particularized, isn't it? It always is. It always has to be. There's no way around that. So the general good is not opposed to the individual good because the individual good is just selfish and mean and, you know, dirty or not pure or something like that. The universal good, the general good, is also opposed to it because it has to be actual through particularized human beings. It has its own interest, like the interest of remaining able to do its functions. All right? So we can go on. He says that the general good, as far as content goes, is opposed to the good of the individual. Consequently, its law is one from which conscience knows itself to be absolutely free, and it gives itself the authority to add to and take from, to neglect as well as to fulfill it. Which means that the norm is not as binding as we'd like it to be, and morality reveals to conscience, Gewissheit, that it has choices in front of it. It could just say, okay, I'm cool with the universal duty and the general good as configured in this place. Seems like things are going along, you know, fairly decently. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'll actually, you know, pay my taxes and follow the laws and, you know, upbraid those who are breaking them and contribute to my community in the ways that they want. Or it can also say, this community's screwed. You know, some people are being treated very unequally, and conscience demands that I take a stand. I have a duty that goes against the duty that's being enunciated here by law and right, however they're embodied. So this is an important turning point, isn't it? He goes on and says, now here's another transition. Then again, the above distinction between duty to the individual and duty to the universal is, in accordance with the nature of the antithesis as such, not something definitely fixed, not something that holds its position in a static way. It can be not only interpreted in multiple ways, it can also change its configuration. This happens when we start thinking out implications of actuality once again. So he says, here we go. The truth is that what the individual does for himself also contributes to the general good. Satisfying your duties to yourself as an individual is, in fact, as we've seen in previous discussions, contributing to the general good. Hegel is going to stress some of the ways in which that takes place here. He's going to make that even more particularized or determinate, right? Clarified. So he says that the more that an individual has made provision for himself, not only is there a greater possibility of his being of service to others, but his actual existence itself consists only in his being and living in contact with others. He goes on and adds, his individual enjoyment essentially has the meaning of putting what is his own at the disposal of others and of helping them to obtain their enjoyment, their satisfaction. What would this look like? Consider, a block party and a barbecue. Everybody brings their own things to it, but people chip in and maybe get a keg for beer, and somebody's playing some music, and they didn't take like a vote where, okay, let's do a ballot, and what kind of music will we have, and whose musical performance mechanism will we use? No, somebody brings out a boom box or puts some stereo speakers in the window, and they start playing, or they use their car stereo or something like that. People start dancing, having a good time, and somebody's over there on a grill, and maybe they brought the meat, and they're actually letting other people eat their stuff without insisting that there be an equal exchange and a reckoning. No, they're like, hey man, you want a hamburger? Oh, you don't eat meat? Here's a veggie burger. I was thoughtful, and in providing for myself, I provided for you. This is just one of so many other ways in which we could express this dynamic as it takes place. We could apply this to the classroom. We could apply this to the office. We could apply this to all sorts of places and situations of life. The more that an individual has made provision for himself or herself, there's a greater possibility of being of service to others. Think about taking care of your body. If we're in a crisis situation like these disaster movies, and I've got to pull some lady out of a car and then carry her on my back to the recently set up medevac. Well, if I'm fat and out of shape because I haven't done my duty to myself to hit the gym every so often, a gym that I pay for, taking time away from other pursuits, then I'm not going to pull that lady out of the car and carry her, right? We could go on and on and on. Hegel's not saying that we should be totally selfish with the idea that by being selfish, I'm automatically conferring goods on others. He probably would not buy into the BS ideology of job creators or things like that. He would be holding CEOs and ownership of companies very accountable in ways that we don't do today. But he is saying something here that I think many of us can easily recognize. Our actual existence can consist in being and living in contact with others. That is absolutely essential to the Hegelian way of looking at things. Remember that the phenomenology itself, as I've stressed at many points, is fundamentally driven by the desire for something. And it's not a desire for absolute knowledge, it's a desire for anerkennen, for recognition, for acknowledgement in relation to others in ways that could be harmonized. And duty is part of that. So he goes on and he says, therefore, in the fulfillment of duty to individuals and so to oneself, the duty of the universal is also fulfilled. If we want the real universal, not just the fake, static, formless, bloodless, standing over us as, like a cop or a rector or whoever it's going to be with all sorts of rules and laws universal, but we want a more living universal, we need to look to the individuals to follow out and fulfill their duties to themselves and thereby to other people. So he goes on and he says, any weighing and comparing of duties which might be made here would be tantamount to calculating the advantage accruing to the universal, the common good, by an action. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad. But then he says, the result would be morality would be made dependent on the necessary contingency of insight. Not everybody has the same degree or objects of insight. And he says, secondly, it's precisely the essence of conscience to have no truck with this calculating and weighing of duties and to make its own decision without reference to any such reasons. And so here, this is not the only way in which this realization could go, but in following out this course, the conscience that is trying to work out what genuine morality would be for itself is going to take a rather, I don't want to just say critical perspective, but a self-referential perspective where it gets to decide how it's going to understand these things for itself. And by doing that, it is bringing in the negativity of consciousness. This is, we see a lot of Hegelian themes working themselves out in a very determinate way in this particular paragraph, all of which is still focused on how we're able to understand duty.